The E series has steadily grown to become one of my favorite gaming franchises over the last decade, with each new entry being better than the last. While I applaud developer Falcom's ambition, NIS Nordics is the first new release where I feel like the series has taken a step backwards. It's by no means a bad game or even less than a good game, but one I certainly had higher hopes for.
The brisk ocean breeze, the wide open sea, smells like a new journey on our horizon.
Despite this being the 10th entry in the series, it actually takes place very early within the Ys timeline, a little before Ys books 1 and 2 and before Memories of Celceta. Adol and Dogi are on a boat sailing through Obelia Gulf where they encounter a group of Normans. Essentially, they're Vikings. They roam Obelia Gulf and sort of run it, but also at the same time protect it. Eventually, Adol and Dogi find their way to the town of Karnak, and here's where the true adventure begins. Adol encounters a mysterious group of monsters known as Grieger. Something odd about them, however, is that no matter how much damage people inflict on them, they just keep coming back to life. Adol and one of the Norman girls named Karja inexplicably become linked together, and they can somehow defeat the Grieger. The two are forced to adventure together to find the source of the Grieger and to find a way to become unlinked. Now, I have to be honest here, while I liked the character of Karja and her relationship with Adol, I just really didn't care for the story overall. Her and Adol being linked together seemed like such a ham-fisted way of creating a combat mechanic, which I'll get to in a little bit. I think my biggest problem with the story is it just doesn't know when to stop. The game has a total of 10 chapters, and the first 3 feel ridiculously long. Characters never stop talking and tend to over-explain things. And I would have been okay with this if the story was interesting or if the dialogue was compelling, but in my opinion, it just isn't. I wanted to be let loose to sail around and to adventure, but the game was constantly stopping me to feed me more story. I felt incredibly frustrating, and there were a handful of times where I considered not finishing the game at all. The stories of these games are a nice bonus, but to me, they've always been about the gameplay. It seems like developer Falcom overextended themselves with the amount of story here in Ys 10, and it made for some really bad pacing, especially at the beginning of the game, which is a real shame because when Ys 10 finally gets going in earnest, it's pretty excellent. For those that felt constricted by the limited scope of Ys 9 and longed for the more open adventure of Ys 8, you should be very excited for what's in store for you here in Ys 10. Not only is the game much more open, but you get your own ship to sail around the world. You can hop off to go on various islands to find treasure, fight monsters, and just so much more. Scope-wise, this is probably the biggest adventure in the entire series. It's an absolute blast to sail around the open seas on your ship, get into ship-to-ship combat, hop off, explore islands, all the while upgrading your ship and your equipment along the way. However, the game is not without its drawbacks. At the beginning, your ship is laughably slow. You can just look at the footage right here now and see how slow your ship goes. Eventually, you get more boost so your ship can go much faster, and there's more of these lanes of wind that will push you along faster. But my goodness, are these opening chapters agonizingly slow, both story-wise and with how slow your ship is. I wouldn't say until the 4th chapter does the game truly let you off the leash and let you roam freely to do whatever you want. It gives you some little taste within the first few chapters, but in my opinion, it just takes way too long to get going in earnest. But thankfully, there are a variety of activities to partake in while you're sailing around. There's ship-to-ship combat, with some of the higher level ship battles allowing you to board the enemy ships to fight enemies for bigger treasures. There's also these islands where you need to take down their defenses, where you can then dock and defeat an enemy force that's inside the island. There's also just little things you can discover in the ocean like animals, sunken treasure, and much more. I will say that the ship's controls are a little funky. If you have the camera positioned directly behind the ship, it's totally fine, but whenever it gets turned sideways or the ship is moving towards the camera, the controls don't flip, and so it becomes very awkward to control. Thankfully, this gets alleviated later in the game when you have more boosts and you can sort of drift with the boat, but for a while the controls feel a little bit clunky. Slowly throughout the game, you'll be able to upgrade your ship to include a wider variety of weapons, increase your defenses, HP, shields, etc. It was very satisfying to constantly be upgrading my ship. For anyone that's played Assassin's Creed Black Flag, it's not quite as good as that, and boarding enemy ships isn't quite as seamless, but overall this was a fun addition to the series and easily the best part of the game. As for the actual on-foot action combat, I'm very torn with what they decided to do here. The game has only 2 controllable characters, Adol and Karja, and for story reasons they're literally linked together, and that also carries over to combat. Now you can switch between them on the fly and use their own individual moves, but if you hold down R2 or the right trigger button, they can attack together. While it's fun for a little while, it kind of grew stale by the end of the game for me. The thing I loved about Ys 9 and Ys 8 is that there was such a huge variety of playable multiple characters, all with unique weapons and moves. But here in Ys 10, you just have these 2 characters. And while you will unlock new abilities, not only for the 2 characters themselves, but for their team-up moves, I still found myself using the same abilities for most of the game. And this really makes the combat feel stale after a while, which is almost unimaginable to say about an Ys game because the combat is always good from start to finish. And while the combat is still very fast and fluid, it has a much heavier emphasis on blocking. And I'm not talking about flash guarding or flash dodging like the previous 2 games, I'm talking about perfectly timed blocks. You have this meter that will slowly build up, and it only builds up when you block or if you do a perfectly timed block and then counterattack enemies. Once the meter is full, your attacks do a lot more damage. So the system seems really built around incentivizing you to block so you can build this meter up. There are some bosses that pretty much require you to get the timing down for that perfect block, or you're just never going to beat that enemy. And speaking of bosses, Ys 10 might have the single worst boss in the entire series. It clearly has a gimmick that I wasn't understanding, so I tried watching some Japanese Let's Plays to see if they could figure it out and tell me what I was doing wrong, but they all had the same problem. No one could figure out what to do with this boss. So I ended up just dropping the difficulty down so I could keep going. Once you play it for yourself, you'll see what I'm talking about. Now this all probably sounds like I hate the game, but actually I really don't. Even when Ys isn't at the top of its game, it's still a lot better than most action RPGs. I feel like Ys 10 really shines when you land on the smaller islands to just explore, find treasures, and fight smaller enemies. That moment-to-moment game loop is really satisfying. What's also super satisfying are 2 new movement mechanics, the mana string and mana ride. The mana string essentially serves as a grappling hook. You can use it not only to latch on to enemies and pull yourself closer to them, but also use it for traversal. Oftentimes in dungeons or just exploring islands, there will be hook points where you have to hook onto an object and swing from branch to branch, or just swing over a big gap. At first, I thought these were canned animations, but it seems like they're a little bit physics driven, so they feel really satisfying to use. And for mana ride, you summon this sort of hoverboard and you can just zoom along on this thing. If you're just trying to get from one end of a map to the next, you can ride it and it'll go a lot faster. It also allows you to go over water or mud without getting slowed down, but also there are these sort of grind rails that will appear throughout the world. These are really satisfying to hop on and jump between. I wish they got a little bit more clever with some of the designs for the board and how you could utilize it in fun ways. There's a few times where there are these sort of chase sequences and you're trying to dodge objects and jump between rails, but there are very few of those. I wish they had just a few more because they were really fun. Overall, Ys 10 is a really fun game to play. When you're let loose to fully explore the world, it's so satisfying to hop from island to island, 100% completing them, totally filling out the map, and then going on to the next part of the world. But I will give you one important warning now. Make a save right before the final dungeon. The game won't warn you, but it should be pretty obvious in chapter 10 when you're about to go to the final dungeon. And I say this because once you beat the game will not kick you back to right before the final dungeon like most RPGs of this scale would. Unfortunately for me, I didn't do that and I couldn't go back to fully complete the game. My map was at 98% completion, and sadly my last save was a few chapters before the end of the game, and there was no way I was going to play all that over again. I'm really hoping in the future Falcom is more aware of this and adds a feature like that to their games, because that was incredibly frustrating to experience.
I guess this is all one big culture shock for someone born and raised on Ys.
Falcom is a relatively small studio that's never really been known for their graphical prowess, but Ys 10 has seen a noticeable upgrade in its visuals from Ys 9. Characters animate a lot smoother, the cutscenes seem more cinematic, and overall the production value is clearly a lot higher. The draw distance could probably use some improvement, as this game is quite big on the open sea and a lot of things will pop in. On PlayStation 5, the game ran very smooth. I didn't have any problems. It pretty much ran at a constant 60 frames per second. And the one constant in Ys games is great music, and Ys 10 is no different. There's nothing here quite on the level of Sunshine Coastline from Ys 8, but overall the soundtrack is fantastic. There's a really satisfying variety of rock guitar tracks, mellow tracks when necessary, and also some more lighthearted ones while on the open sea adventuring. I quite enjoyed all the music this game had to offer, and if you've liked any of the music in the past games, you'll definitely enjoy this as well. Now, there are two things I want to note in terms of bugs. For one, I noticed that quite a few of a particular type of cutscene still had the text in Japanese. Now, to be clear, I was playing in English, both the audio and the text, so this was not some kind of error on my end, and some of this was really late into the game. I did notify NIS America of this, and they said a patch was incoming, but as of the recording for this video, it still has not been patched. However, the embargo date for this review is pretty early compared to the release date of the game, so there's still plenty of time for them to patch it by launch day. But to be clear, it doesn't really matter because the voices in English are still there, so as long as you can hear it, it's not super disruptive overall. Also, there's a feature in the game where you can replay the battles where you storm the island for better scores. However, it wouldn't let me scroll down past the first option for me to replay those other battles, so I couldn't retry any of them. That was super annoying because I got an S rank on all but one battle, and it was so annoying to look at that list and see that one A rank, and I couldn't even go down to retry it. I talked with other creators behind the scenes, and both of these problems seem to be limited to the PlayStation 5 version, so if you're playing on PC or some other version, apparently those don't have these issues. While Ys 10 has some major pacing problems and some design choices that I really don't agree with, it's still a fun game overall. Exploring the open seas is incredibly satisfying, the action combat is fun, and the new movement mechanics made for exhilarating moment-to-moment gameplay. That said, I feel like this game will be divisive for its lack of playable characters and its heavy emphasis on blocking. Your tolerance for those two things will really dictate how much you're going to enjoy this game. That said, there is a ton of content in this game that could keep you busy for well past 40 to 50 hours. For me, I beat the game in around 35 hours, but like I said earlier, I couldn't go back to finish everything there was to offer, so that's not a true indicator of how much time you could truly spend with this game. But I'm super curious to hear what everyone thinks of Ys 10 leading into its release, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. And to hear about another amazing JRPG, be sure to watch this video next.